The Outer Banks of North Carolina exists as a 200-mile stretch of fragile barrier islands where the Atlantic Ocean presses endlessly against the soft line of Pamlico Sound. It is a place where land and sea are in constant negotiation, a landscape sculpted by shifting sand dunes, rising tides, and winds that never rest. Lighthouses stand like ancient sentinels on the horizon, their beacons sweeping across the night to guide sailors through the fog, while the scent of salt and seaweed lingers in the air like a memory that never fades. Here, every grain of sand seems to carry a story. Old fishing villages survive between storms, their weather-beaten cottages leaning against the wind, their piers creaking under the rhythm of the waves. In summer, the quiet isolation gives way to life. The Outer Banks swells from 35,000 year-round residents to over 300,000 visitors. The narrow roads fill with cars carrying surfboards, beach chairs, and the restless energy of people escaping their ordinary routines. At the center of this delicate chain of islands lies Nags Head, a town that has long attracted a very particular kind of visitor. College students arrive in droves each May, seeking cheap rent, freedom, and the kind of oceanfront adventure that feels like youth distilled into sunlight and salt air. Families return year after year to the same houses, carving their names into porch railings and their memories into generations. And then there are the young wanderers, the ones chasing both paychecks and purpose, who come to work the piers, serve seafood to strangers, and watch the sun sink into the Atlantic each night as if the horizon itself could promise answers. In June of 2003, Emma Catherine Walsh was one of them. 21 years old, bright, ambitious, and in love with the ocean. She had just finished her junior year at UNC Wilmington, majoring in marine biology, a field that reflected her lifelong fascination with the sea. That summer, she accepted a seasonal job at the Nags Head Pier, dividing her time between the seafood restaurant upstairs and the tackle shop below. The position paid $8.50 an hour plus tips, enough to cover food and rent at a weathered cottage 3 blocks from the beach. But for Emma, it wasn't just about money. She told her parents it was an educational experience outside the classroom, a chance to live by the water, she hoped one day to study professionally. To her, it was the beginning of something bigger, a test of independence, a first taste of who she was becoming. But that summer would not end the way anyone expected. Emma Catherine Walsh was last seen alive on the night of June 19, 2003, walking alone along the shoreline near milepost 16. It was just before midnight, the air was still, the moon reflected silver across the water, and the only sounds were the waves folding over themselves in the dark. A witness later recalled seeing her walking barefoot, holding her sandals in one hand, her turquoise tank top faintly visible in the moonlight. At approximately 11:40 p.m., she vanished into the quiet expanse of the Atlantic night. For 19 years there were no answers, no body, no clues, no closure. Then, in August 2022, nearly 2 decades later, a routine arrest in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, of a man displaced years earlier by Hurricane Katrina triggered an unexpected DNA match. That match would not only solve Emma's disappearance, but expose a serial predator whose crimes spanned multiple states, multiple victims, and almost 20 years of unchecked violence. This is the story of how a natural disaster, a genealogical database, and a detective who refused to let Emma Walsh be forgotten finally converged to bring truth to light and justice to a family that had almost lost hope. Emma Catherine Walsh was born on November 3, 1981, at New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, North Carolina, to parents David and Patricia Walsh. She was their only child, arriving after years of uncertainty and heartbreak. Patricia had suffered 2 miscarriages before Emma, losses that had left both parents quietly convinced that parenthood might not be possible for them. When Emma finally arrived, healthy, pink, and full of life, it felt like a small miracle, the kind that redefines a family's entire world. Patricia would later say that the moment she held Emma in her arms, She felt something close to disbelief. The dark-haired newborn with her father's hazel eyes represented everything they had prayed for and almost given up hoping to receive. From that day forward, their lives revolved around her completely. David Walsh worked as a civil engineer for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, a steady, practical man who built bridges and roads, but also believed in building stability at home. His work eventually relocated the family from Raleigh to Wilmington in 1985, when Emma was 4. Patricia, a third-grade teacher at Bellamy Elementary, was the gentle, nurturing counterbalance to David's structured precision. Her students adored her. She was the kind of teacher who spent her own money expanding her classroom library, who stayed late helping struggling readers, who treated each child as if they were her own. The Walsh family lived in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house in Wilmington's Ogden neighborhood, a quiet, tree-lined area filled with families and the kind of summer evenings where children played street hockey until the glow of streetlights called them home. It was an ordinary home, but one filled with books, laughter, and the faint sound of the ocean wind that drifted inland on humid nights. From the time she could walk, Emma was a collector of the natural world. Seashells, smooth stones, feathers, bits of coral, anything that caught her curious eye found its way into her growing collection of jars and boxes. She didn't just see beauty in nature, she wanted to understand it. By age 7, she was already telling people she wanted to be an ocean scientist. Later, she would learn the word marine biologist, and it became her identity. The Walsh family spent countless weekends at Wrightsville Beach, their favorite place. While other children built sandcastles, Emma crouched over tide pools, studying the tiny worlds trapped between rocks. She'd gently scoop hermit crabs into her palms, watching them retreat into their shells with quiet fascination. Patricia often had to remind her to reapply sunscreen because Emma would lose all sense of time when she was near the water. At Hoggard High School, Emma excelled in science classes, biology, environmental studies, and chemistry. She wasn't loud or outgoing. She was the quiet, steady presence in the room, the one teachers relied on. Public speaking terrified her, but she confronted that fear by joining the environmental club, where she slowly learned to present her research on coastal erosion and sea turtle nesting habits. That quiet courage, pushing through fear instead of avoiding it, would become one of her defining traits. Emma wasn't the kind of person who needed a large circle of friends. She preferred a few deep, loyal connections. Her friends described her as thoughtful, observant, and kind. She had a soft voice but sharp insight. At gatherings, she listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, people listened back. She had that rare gift of making others feel seen. Her acceptance into UNC Wilmington seemed inevitable. The university was close to home, surrounded by the same coastal environment that had always inspired her, and its marine biology program was one of the best in the region. For Emma, it was the perfect fit, a place where her love of the ocean could merge with real science, with purpose. By her junior year in 2003, she had declared a concentration in coastal ecology and had begun discussing graduate school opportunities with her professors. The summer job at Nags Head Pier wasn't just a way to make money, it was a stepping stone. She wanted to observe fish populations firsthand, study patterns she could one day turn into research. Her professors encouraged her curiosity. Her parents, however, were cautious. David had read about Nags Head's summer crowd, the parties, the alcohol, the transience of seasonal workers who came and went without roots. He worried about his daughter's safety, about her being far from home among strangers. Patricia, ever the mediator, reminded him that Emma was responsible, grounded, and deserved to experience life beyond the comfort of Wilmington. She needs this, Patricia had told him. She needs to see who she is when we're not watching. Eventually, they compromised. Emma would call home twice a week, on Wednesdays and Sundays, without fail. She would keep her cell phone with her at all times, even though in 2003 carrying one wasn't yet second nature. David had bought her the phone himself, his quiet way of ensuring she was never unreachable. Emma had laughed, rolled her eyes, and said, "Dad, I'll be fine." On June 15, 2003, David and Patricia drove Emma to Nags Head. They helped her unpack in the small cottage she'd share with two other young women, both college students, both working summer jobs. They took her to dinner that evening at Sam and Omi's, a local seafood restaurant that had been open since 1937. They ordered fried shrimp, hush puppies, and iced tea. Emma talked about her plans for the summer, collecting data on fish migrations, reading on the porch, watching sunsets after her shifts. The next morning, David and Patricia hugged her goodbye. Patricia would later write in her journal that night, "She looked so happy, so ready, so alive." 4 days later, Emma Walsh disappeared. Thursday, June 19, 2003, began like any other bright, humid summer day on the Outer Banks. The air was thick with salt and sunscreen, the boardwalks humming with tourists carrying towels and coolers. By mid-morning, the line at the Nags Head Pier restaurant curved out onto the planks, and among the waitresses moving swiftly between tables was Emma Walsh, hair tied back, notebook tucked into her apron pocket, polite smile fixed even during the rush. She poured coffee for fishermen who'd been casting since dawn, refilled juice glasses for families in flip-flops, and traded small jokes with regulars who remembered her from earlier shifts. Her co-workers later said she seemed normal that day, tired from the 5:30 a.m. start, but cheerful, steady, focused. There was nothing in her manner to suggest that this would be the last ordinary morning of her life. Her shift ended at 2 p.m. Emma walked home beneath the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt, the smell of fried seafood following her from the pier. At the small, weather-worn cottage she shared with Kristen Delgado and Amanda Choi, she showered, changed into shorts and a loose t-shirt, and spent the afternoon reading on the screened porch. The book was about coral reef ecosystems, typical of her, half leisure, half study. Now and then she set the book aside, walked barefoot down the wooden path to the beach, and cooled herself in the surf before returning to her chair, damp hair dripping onto the pages. It was, in every sense, a simple coastal day. At 7:30 p.m., Kristen cooked spaghetti with jarred marinara. The three young women ate together on the porch, the sun lowering into a pale orange sky, the cicadas beginning their night chorus. They talked about work schedules, shared gossip from the pier, and laughed about tourists who tried to order sushi at a fry house. Their next shared day off was approaching, and they debated whether to drive up to Corolla or simply spend it sleeping late and sunbathing. Someone mentioned a bonfire party that would start later that night near milepost 18, 2 miles north of their cottage, organized by seasonal workers from several local restaurants and surf shops. At first, Emma declined. She said she was tired and wanted to finish the biography of marine biologist Sylvia Earle that she'd been reading. But around 10:15 p.m., the mood of the night changed. The air had cooled to a perfect 72 degrees. The sky was so clear that even faint stars seemed sharp. Emma, never one to waste a good ocean evening, decided to go for a walk, perhaps stop by the bonfire for an hour, maybe not. She changed into denim shorts and a turquoise tank top, slipped her phone, battery at roughly 60%, into her pocket, and told her roommates she'd be back by midnight. She left through the back door that opened directly onto the sandy access path leading toward the beach. Kristen and Amanda, both exhausted from double shifts earlier in the week, went to bed around 11. They assumed Emma had reached the bonfire safely. After all, the beach felt safe in Nags Head, crowded enough even at night, familiar, open. There was no reason to imagine danger in the rhythm of the waves, but Emma Walsh never arrived at the bonfire. The last verified sighting came from a couple walking their Labrador near milepost 16, about halfway between her cottage and the gathering. They noticed a young woman walking north barefoot, sandals dangling from one hand. She looked relaxed, head tilted toward the sea as though listening. As they passed, she smiled and said softly, "Beautiful night." They answered, "Sure is," and kept walking. It was 11:40 p.m. That brief exchange became the final recorded moment of Emma's life. When Kristen awoke at 6:45 a.m. for her breakfast shift, she saw that Emma's bed was empty and neatly made. It looked as though no one had slept there. Still half asleep herself, she assumed Emma had stayed with friends from the bonfire. It wasn't unusual. Many seasonal workers bunked together after late nights rather than walk the dark shoreline alone. By early afternoon, unease began to grow. Emma hadn't shown up for her 2 p.m. shift at the pier, something she had never done without notice. Calls to her cell went straight to voicemail. By 3:30, Kristen informed their supervisor. By 4:15, she and Amanda were retracing Emma's likely route up the beach, asking strangers if anyone had seen a young woman in a turquoise top. The sand was already swept smooth by the tide, the night's footprints gone. When they reached the stretch of dunes where the bonfire had burned, they found only cold ash, crushed beer cans, and a few cigarette butts glinting in the sand. No one remembered seeing Emma there. At 5:47 p.m., Kristen placed the call that would change everything, a missing person report to the Dare County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Michael Thornton responded to the missing person report at the Walsh cottage at 6:20 p.m. on June 20, 2003. The sky was still bright. Gulls circled above the rooftops, and the late-day wind carried the smell of salt and cut grass. Thornton's first impression, later written into his incident report, reflected the quiet skepticism common in beach town policing. Most missing young adults turned up within a day or two, embarrassed, sunburned, hungover. The working theory was simple. Emma Walsh had likely gone home with someone from the bonfire, lost track of time, phone battery dead. Nothing more. Inside the small cottage, Kristen Delgado and Amanda Choi insisted otherwise. They told him Emma wasn't impulsive, she didn't vanish without a word. Her bed was untouched, her phone unanswered, her shift missed for the first time ever. Thornton listened politely, took notes, and promised to file the report. He had 2 other calls waiting. When he left, the roommates watched his cruiser pull away and felt the first real tremor of dread settle in. At 7:30 p.m., the phone rang in Wilmington. Patricia Walsh answered to the sound of Kristen's trembling voice. Within seconds, every mother's nightmare translated into words, "We can't find Emma." Patricia's hands began to shake. She called out for David, and by the time he reached the kitchen, she was already saying, "Something's happened to her." It wasn't panic, it was certainty. Emma had always called on schedule, every Wednesday and Sunday. This was Thursday. Silence meant trouble. They drove through the night, headlights carving the long black ribbon of Highway 64 toward the coast. David gripped the wheel in silence. Patricia stared out the window, replaying every conversation with their daughter. Had she sounded tired, distracted, worried? They reached Nags Head just after 11 p.m. The cottage door was open, the porch light on, 2 frightened young women waiting inside with untouched cups of coffee. The search had already begun, friends combing the beach with flashlights, phone calls to hospitals and police stations. Every answer was the same. No one had seen Emma Walsh. At 11:45 p.m., David phoned the Dare County Sheriff's Department himself. His voice was controlled but urgent. He demanded a detective. The dispatcher repeated procedure. Adult missing less than 24 hours. No evidence of foul play. David's reply was short. "My daughter's not a runaway." He was told detectives would review the case in the morning. That night he sat in the living room armchair, staring at Emma's empty shoes by the door, until dawn broke through the blinds. The next morning, Detective Barbara Chen from the Criminal Investigations Division was assigned the case. 12 years on the force, disciplined, methodical, accustomed to the chaos of tourist season, bar fights, thefts, occasional drownings. At first, she shared the common assumption of voluntary disappearance. 21-year-olds sometimes needed space, beaches blurred responsibilities. But as she interviewed Emma's roommates and parents, reviewed phone logs, and studied the young woman's habits, That assumption began to crack. Emma's cell phone had last pinged a tower covering the milepost 15 to 17 area at 11:52 p.m. on June 19th. Then silence. Either the phone was powered off, the battery dead, or it had been destroyed. Her bank account showed no withdrawals, her credit card no new charges. Her Honda Accord sat untouched outside the cottage. Every personal item, clothes, laptop, notebooks, even her journal, remained exactly where she had left them. Nothing pointed to flight. Everything pointed to interruption. On June 22nd, Chen organized a large-scale beach search. Dozens of volunteers joined, local residents, lifeguards, pier workers, tourists who'd seen the flyers taped to storefronts. They formed lines stretching from milepost 12 to 20, walking slowly, eyes down, scanning for any scrap of fabric or sign of struggle. The Coast Guard searched offshore waters with spotlights and sonar, while helicopters traced lazy circles above the dunes. For 3 days they searched. The ocean gave nothing back. Flyers bearing Emma's photograph multiplied across Dare County, taped to grocery store doors, pinned to gas pump bulletin boards, fluttering from telephone poles. Tips came in: a girl who might have looked like her buying sunscreen, another seen boarding a bus. Each lead ended in disappointment. None were Emma. By June 28th, Detective Chen could no longer justify the runaway theory. No one vanishes this completely of their own choice. No calls, no cash, no trace. Logic turned to dread. Something violent had happened between milepost 16 and midnight. Her challenge was the very character of the Outer Banks itself. In summer, the population exploded. Thousands of tourists arrived weekly, then disappeared again to every corner of the country. Seasonal workers came under first names only. Rental houses changed occupants every Saturday. License plate readers didn't yet exist. Security cameras were rare, mostly grainy feeds from cash registers. Cell phone tracking was primitive, limited to tower zones several miles wide. The investigation was like searching for a shadow on moving sand. Chen and her small team began interviewing anyone who might have crossed paths with Emma that night. She spoke with the couple walking their dog at 11:40 p.m. They remembered the turquoise shirt, the soft smile, nothing more. She visited every bar, motel, and pier from Kill Devil Hills to Kitty Hawk, compiling lists of employees, checking guest registers for anyone staying near milepost 16. She interviewed every attendee from the bonfire party. Each confirmed Emma had never arrived. Hospitals, morgues, shelters, all checked, all empty of answers. Forensics processed the beach corridor between the cottage and milepost 18. But sand is a living surface. It erases itself twice a day. Footprints, fibers, even blood dissolve under tide and wind. The evidence table filled with ordinary debris, bottle caps, cigarette ends, seaweed, driftwood. None linked to Emma. It was a crime scene that refused to exist. By mid-July 2003, the search slowed to a painful crawl. Chen still followed every new rumor, but the trail was cooling by the hour. The press moved on. Tourists came and went. For the Walsh family, time stopped. David Walsh resigned from his engineering job to devote himself entirely to finding his daughter. He built a website, printed thousands of flyers, mailed packets to news stations and private investigators. The offered reward grew from $5,000 to $50,000 as the years passed. Patricia, still teaching, carried the weight differently. Her kindness to students deepened even as her own joy faded. Friends said she smiled less, laughed rarely. The couple's once steady marriage bent under the strain, but never broke. They were united by absence. By 2010, the case remained open in name only. Files gathered dust, reviewed each year with no new results. Detective Chen retired in 2012, handing over a meticulously organized but painfully thin folder to her successor. The younger detectives kept Emma's name on their list of cold cases, revisiting it whenever new technology or grants allowed. Nothing changed. Then came August 29, 2005, and Hurricane Katrina, a catastrophe far away that would, years later, blow open the silence surrounding Emma Walsh's disappearance. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005. It arrived as a Category 3 storm, carrying winds that tore through roofs and storm surges that swallowed neighborhoods whole. By dawn, it had already begun rewriting history. Levees failed across New Orleans, sending walls of water through the 9th Ward and the Lower Garden District. Entire blocks disappeared beneath 10 feet of floodwater. Helicopters circled helplessly above rooftops where families waved sheets and cried out for help. What followed was one of the most devastating natural disasters in American memory. In less than 48 hours, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. The storm displaced more than 1 million people across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Nearly 2,000 lives were lost. The chaos was staggering. Phones dead, records destroyed, families scattered. The city's infrastructure collapsed under the combined weight of wind, flood, and governmental paralysis. The images that followed, the overcrowded Superdome, the floating cars, the handwritten pleas for rescue, became burned into the collective American consciousness. Amid that chaos, hundreds of thousands of evacuees scattered across the country, highways jammed with vehicles heading north, churches opened gymnasiums for sleeping cots. FEMA relief lines stretched for hours in the August heat. Many evacuees were never able to return to their homes. Some would never be officially accounted for at all. One of those evacuees was a man named Marcus Duval. At the time, Duval was 34 years old, living in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, a part of the city hit hardest by the flooding. 2 days before Katrina made landfall, he had packed his car with a duffel bag, a box of canned food, and a few changes of clothes, then headed north to Baton Rouge, where a cousin had offered him a couch. Like so many others, he believed he'd be back within a week, maybe 2. But when the levees failed, home ceased to exist. In Baton Rouge, life for the evacuees was improvised. Schools became shelters. Parking lots turned into relief centers. FEMA trailers crowded the city's outskirts. For a while, Duval blended perfectly into this mass of displaced survivors. He was quiet, polite, seemingly grateful. He found temporary construction work helping rebuild damaged homes and eventually secured a modest one-bedroom apartment on the city's south side. To his neighbors, he was just another man trying to start over, one of countless survivors of a tragedy that had uprooted a generation. What no one in Baton Rouge knew was that Marcus Duval was not who he claimed to be. His birth name was Marcus Devin Wilkes, and his past was far darker than his mild, quiet exterior suggested. Public records and old booking files, many of them stored in flooded courthouses back in New Orleans, told the story of a man with a criminal history stretching back nearly a decade. Between 1995 and 2003, Wilkes had been arrested 3 separate times for crimes ranging from simple battery to vehicular theft. His most serious conviction came in 2000 when he was sentenced to 14 months in Louisiana State Prison for aggravated assault. During that incarceration, his DNA was collected and entered into Louisiana's state database, as required for violent offenders. After his release in 2001, Wilkes drifted, low-level jobs, short temp work, cheap motels. Then he changed his name legally to Marcus Duval, citing a desire to start fresh. It was a convenient reinvention, and it worked. The name change effectively separated him from his criminal record in the years before Katrina. By the time the hurricane came, Wilkes, now Duval, was living quietly under his new identity, staying out of legal trouble. The storm, in a cruel twist of fate, helped him disappear completely. In the chaos that followed Katrina, thousands of Louisiana's criminal records were misplaced, damaged, or destroyed. Fingerprint files were lost in flooded evidence rooms, parole reports went missing, people moved, names changed, databases failed to sync. For a man like Duval, it was as if the floodwaters had washed away his past. In Baton Rouge, he became invisible. He worked long hours repairing roofs and drywall for hurricane-damaged homes, paid cash when possible, avoided attention. Neighbors described him as quiet, private, almost polite. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't threatening either. Occasionally, he'd share a beer with other workers after a job, talk briefly about how hard the storm had hit back home, and then retreat into silence. He attended a local Baptist church now and then, enough to appear stable, but never enough to build relationships. To most, he was simply another displaced man rebuilding a broken life. But beneath that quiet surface, Marcus Duval carried the same darkness that had followed him through every place he'd lived. He had learned to hide in plain sight, among people who had lost everything, in a city overwhelmed by transience and tragedy. For 17 years after Katrina, he would manage to stay off the radar of law enforcement, never realizing that the smallest misstep could eventually expose everything. That misstep came on March 15, 2022. A single night, a domestic disturbance, and a parole violation would soon unearth the truth, and finally link a forgotten storm survivor in Baton Rouge to a 19-year-old cold case in North Carolina. On the night of March 15, 2022, the quiet suburban rhythm of Perkins Road in Baton Rouge was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and muffled screams. Neighbors, startled from evening routines, peeked through blinds and heard what sounded like a violent argument escalating into something much worse. Several of them called 911. The reports were consistent: a woman screaming, a man shouting, the unmistakable crash of furniture against walls. At 9:47 p.m., 2 Baton Rouge police units arrived at the apartment complex. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead as officers approached Unit 3B. Standing in the doorway was Marcus Duval, breathing hard, sweat darkening the collar of his T-shirt. Behind him, the apartment was a wreck. Overturned coffee table, shards of a lamp scattered across the floor. His girlfriend, Jennifer Morrison, 38 years old, was pressed against the far wall, trembling. Her left cheekbone was already swelling, her lips split, her voice shaking as she told officers, "He tried to choke me." Duval denied everything. He said they'd argued about money, that she'd fallen, that it was all a misunderstanding. But the injuries spoke for themselves. The officers separated them, called for paramedics, and began routine identification checks. It was during this simple, procedural step that Duval's carefully constructed new life began to unravel. A standard background query revealed 2 unexpected red flags. First, Marcus Duval was listed as being on lifetime parole stemming from a violent felony conviction in Louisiana in 2001, a detail that hadn't surfaced in years because of poor interdepartmental record-keeping after Hurricane Katrina. Second, an outstanding warrant had been issued in 2019 for failure to report to his parole officer, a technical violation that had gone unnoticed until now. As the officers read these results aloud, Duval's demeanor changed. His tone grew clipped, defensive. He demanded to know why they were digging up old stuff. He insisted it was a mistake, but it wasn't. His name, his old name, Marcus Devin Wilkes, was still in the system, buried in a database, finally resynchronized with national law enforcement records just months earlier. The storm that had once erased his past had, ironically, also preserved the evidence that would one day destroy him. Duval was handcuffed on the spot and escorted to the waiting patrol car. Jennifer Morrison was taken to Baton Rouge General Medical Center, where doctors documented her injuries: a bruised cheekbone, cuts to her mouth, and faint red marks encircling her neck, signs of a strangulation attempt. In her later statement, she told detectives that Duval had snapped during an argument over overdue rent, pinning her against the wall, choking her until she nearly blacked out. The assault stopped only when neighbors began pounding on the door and shouting that the police were on their way. Under Louisiana law, the combination of domestic battery and parole violation carried serious penalties. For Duval, it meant years, possibly decades, behind bars. But what neither he nor the officers knew that night was that this arrest would do something far greater than return him to prison. It would finally expose him for what he truly was. The next morning, on March 16, 2022, Duval was booked into East Baton Rouge Parish Prison. As part of routine intake, technicians recorded his fingerprints, took photographs, and, most crucially, collected a fresh DNA sample via a buccal swab. The process was quick, impersonal, one of thousands performed that year. The sample was then submitted to the CODIS National Database, where it would automatically be cross-checked against unsolved cases across the country. For nearly 2 decades, Duvall had managed to remain invisible, moving between states, changing jobs, never staying long enough for background checks to catch up with him. But in that sterile booking room, under fluorescent lights, his past and present finally collided. Within days, his DNA would flag a match to a case file nearly 19 years old from a coastal county on the other side of the country. It was the first crack in a wall of silence that had stood since the summer of 2003. A storm, a routine arrest, and a swab of saliva, 3 small, unrelated events that would soon unravel the mystery of Emma Catherine Walsh and expose the man responsible for her disappearance. In 2018, the Dare County Sheriff's Department received a small but crucial grant from the North Carolina Governor's Crime Commission, funding meant to bring modern forensic science to cases long thought unsolvable. Detective James Reeves, who had inherited the Emma Walsh files from his predecessor, decided immediately which case would be first in line. For years he'd kept the dusty evidence box on a shelf above his desk, a quiet reminder of a 21-year-old who had simply vanished into the night. Now, with new technology at hand, he saw a sliver of possibility. Reeves gathered everything that had been preserved since 2003. Among the items were Emma's turquoise tank top, a single earring, and a sand-caked hair tie, all recovered in the weeks following her disappearance. The tank top had been found 3 weeks later, washed ashore near milepost 14, about 2 miles south of where she was last seen. In 2003, it had been processed using the DNA testing available at the time, revealing mixed genetic material, Emma's, plus traces from at least 2 unidentified individuals. With the technology of that era, contamination was almost impossible to separate from evidence. Investigators had written it off as inconclusive, but science doesn't stand still. By 2018, new extraction and amplification techniques allowed forensic scientists to isolate DNA from samples that once seemed hopelessly degraded. Reeves sent the tank top to the North Carolina State Crime Laboratory, requesting a full reanalysis under the newly funded program. It took months, the lab technicians working carefully, rehydrating fibers, rerunning tests with more sensitive reagents. What emerged was a clean, partial male DNA profile, genetic material concentrated around the right shoulder and back of the shirt, in a pattern consistent with someone grabbing Emma from behind. When the results came back, Reeves read them 3 times. For the first time in 15 years, the case had something tangible, a profile, a fingerprint in genetic form. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database used to compare DNA from crime scenes with that of known offenders. The upload occurred in early 2019. Then came the waiting, months, then years of silence. No match. The case stayed open, the DNA sitting in the system like a locked door with no key. And then, 3 years later, on March 17, 2022, that door opened. One day after the arrest of Marcus Duvall in Baton Rouge, his freshly collected DNA sample entered CODIS as part of routine booking. Within hours, the system flagged a hit. The match was automatic, precise, undeniable. A cold case entry from North Carolina linked directly to a new offender record from Louisiana. On the morning of March 18th, Detective Reeves sat at his desk, surrounded by paperwork from unrelated cases. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the office when the email arrived. Subject line, CODIS hit notification, Walsh, Emma Catherine, 2003. He froze, then opened it. Inside was the confirmation. A positive DNA match had been made between evidence recovered from Emma Walsh's turquoise tank top and a 51-year-old man named Marcus Duvall, currently in custody in Baton Rouge for domestic violence and parole violation. Pause. slow, deliberate tone. Reeves would later describe that moment as surreal, like watching a door open into the past. For 19 years, the case had been a story without an ending. Now, for the first time, there was a name, a living suspect. He read the email twice more, as if making sure it was real. Then he pushed back his chair, stood up, and quietly said to himself, "We got him." From that point on, the tempo of the investigation changed completely. Reeves immediately contacted the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Department, confirming that Duvall was in custody. He requested that a detainer be placed, ensuring Duvall couldn't be released, while North Carolina prepared formal extradition papers. Within hours, detectives from both states were in contact, exchanging files, photos, and criminal histories. Reeves began assembling everything he'd need to prove that this man, the quiet construction worker, the forgotten evacuee from a long-ago storm, had once walked the beaches of Nags Head, North Carolina, on a June night in 2003. The connection seemed impossible at first glance. Two worlds, nearly 2 decades apart. But the science was absolute. The DNA didn't lie. In the following days, Reeves reread every page of Emma's case file, looking for threads that might tie Duvall to that time and place. He mapped every hotel, every job site, every temporary address Duvall had ever used. Slowly, a pattern began to form, one that stretched not just across the Carolinas, but up and down the entire Atlantic coast. The discovery was chilling. The story of Emma Walsh was not an isolated tragedy. It was the missing piece in a chain of violence that had gone unnoticed for nearly 20 years. Detective James Reeves and his team began the painstaking work of reconstructing Marcus Duvall's life, one city, 1 year, one employer at a time. It was an investigation that stretched across decades and state lines, uncovering a timeline that had gone unnoticed for far too long. They weren't just looking for where he had lived, they were tracing his pattern, his movement, the shadow he cast as he drifted from coast to coast. It didn't take long for the picture to turn dark. In June of 2003, the summer Emma Walsh disappeared. Marcus, still known under his original name, Marcus Devin Wilkes, had been living in Norfolk, Virginia, roughly 90 miles north of Nags Head. Employment records from a coastal hotel chain showed he'd been hired as a seasonal maintenance worker, a job that had him rotating between several properties along the Atlantic coast, Virginia Beach, Kill Devil Hills, and occasionally Nags Head itself. His duties were simple: repair work, electrical fixes, landscaping, routine maintenance. The job gave him unrestricted mobility, access to employee areas, and a reason to be anywhere at any hour. A pay stub confirmed that Wilkes had clocked out of his shift at a hotel in Kill Devil Hills at 8 p.m. on June 19, 2003, just 3 hours before Emma was last seen alive on the beach at milepost 16. That proximity, both in time and distance, made Reeves pause. A hotel employee working alone, with a car and no alibi past 8 o'clock, that was not a coincidence. When Reeves began pulling Duvall's old personnel records, a pattern of short-term employment emerged. 6 months here, 4 months there, always leaving quietly, always moving on before background checks caught up. He'd held maintenance jobs at coastal hotels and construction sites in nearly every southern state. Each time he'd vanished just before reports of missing women surfaced in the same region. At first glance, it looked like bad luck. On closer inspection, it looked like a trail. In 2004, that trail led to Virginia Beach and a woman named Lisa Chen. Chen had filed a police report describing a terrifying assault that mirrored the method Reeves was beginning to suspect. She'd met Wilkes at a beach bar, chatted over drinks, and later walked with him along the shore. Without warning, he'd attacked her, hands around her throat, trying to drag her behind a dune. She fought back, scratching his face, screaming until nearby fishermen's flashlights spooked him. He fled into the darkness. The Virginia Beach Police Department had identified a suspect matching Wilkes's description, but he had left the area days later, before the warrant could be served. The case went cold. Now, 18 years later, When Lisa Chen was shown a current photo of Marcus Duval, she didn't hesitate. "That's him," she said quietly. "I'll never forget that face." From there, Reeves expanded the scope. He sent inquiries to every jurisdiction where Duval had ever worked or been arrested. The results painted a chilling mosaic of predation that spanned the southeastern United States. In 2006, a 25-year-old woman named Rachel Martinez vanished in Charleston, South Carolina. She was last seen leaving a seafood bar near the waterfront, walking alone to her car. Her body was never found. Employment records showed that Duval had been working construction in Charleston that same summer. In 2008, Angela Foster disappeared in Mobile, Alabama after a late shift at a restaurant near the harbor. Once again, Duval was living there at the time, employed by a local roofing company. Again, no arrest, no suspect, no closure. By 2009, Duval had returned to New Orleans, now rebuilt from Katrina's destruction. He blended easily into the crowds of laborers who came to the city for reconstruction work. Police reports from that period, many unfiled or misclassified at the time, later revealed several women reporting assaults by a man who matched his build and mannerisms, soft-spoken, polite at first, then suddenly violent. None of those reports led to arrest. Most victims never knew his name. Between 2011 and 2022, he lived in Baton Rouge, the longest stretch of stability he ever had. There, the pattern continued: smaller incidents of domestic violence, arguments that ended with bruises and apologies, neighbors who described strange noises but never called police. He was a predator, hiding behind routine, violence disguised by familiarity. Reeves's timeline now stretched across 4 states and nearly 20 years. Every move Duval made, every new job, coincided with another woman's disappearance or assault. It was no longer coincidence, it was a signature. The geography of his life matched the geography of other people's grief. When Reeves looked up from the wall of photos pinned in his office, the faces of Emma, Rachel, Angela, and the sketch of Lisa Chen, he realized what they were dealing with. Marcus Duval wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial predator, one who had used hurricanes, transient jobs, and anonymity to conceal a lifetime of violence. For nearly 2 decades, he had traveled the southern coastline, leaving destruction in his wake, like a storm that moved from one shore to another, calm between each strike, always waiting for the next opportunity. On the afternoon of April 25, 2022, Detective James Reeves traveled to East Baton Rouge Parish Prison to confront the man whose DNA had finally spoken for Emma Walsh. It was a clear day outside, humid, the kind of Louisiana heat that sticks to your skin, but inside the jail, the air was cold, dry, almost sterile. The interrogation room was small and bare: 1 table, 2 metal chairs, a wall-mounted camera blinking red in the corner. Every word, every breath, every silence would be recorded. At 2 p.m., the door opened. Marcus Duval entered wearing an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed loosely in front of him. He was 51 years old now, but life had aged him far beyond that number. His hair was graying, cut short. Deep creases ran along his forehead and around his mouth. His eyes, Reeves would later say, were vacant, like a man who'd already made peace with what he was. Reeves introduced himself quietly. "Detective James Reeves, Dare County Sheriff's Department." "I'm here about Emma Walsh." Duval sat down without speaking. He stared at the table, jaw tightening slightly, the cuffs clinking against the metal. Reeves began methodically, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The DNA match, the employment records from the Kill Devil Hills Hotel, the timeline that placed him within 5 miles of where Emma was last seen, the similar assaults that followed him from state to state. Reeves wasn't trying to provoke him. He was trying to corner him with facts. For nearly half an hour, Duval said nothing. His breathing stayed even. His gaze never lifted. Then Reeves slid a photograph across the table. A smiling young woman in her early 20s, wearing a light blue graduation dress, sunlight on her face. "That's Emma," he said softly. "She was 21. Her parents still live in Wilmington. They never stopped looking for her." Something shifted in Duval's face, not remorse, not even surprise, just a flicker of recognition, a momentary tightening around the eyes, like a man remembering a detail from a dream. Reeves leaned forward. "You know her, don't you?" The silence stretched long enough that the camera picked up the faint buzz of the fluorescent light. Over the next 6 hours, Reeves kept the pressure steady but calm. He offered water, let the silence hang, then returned to the evidence. After consulting briefly with a public defender who told him the DNA alone could convict him, Duval made a decision. He exhaled slowly and said the words Reeves had been waiting nearly 2 decades to hear. "Yeah," he said, "I remember her." What followed was a 6-hour confession that would later be described by prosecutors as devoid of empathy and almost clinical in detail. Duval told the story with no emotion. On the night of June 19, 2003, he had finished his maintenance shift around 8 p.m. and driven south toward Nags Head, looking for company. He parked his car along the dunes near milepost 16, saw a woman walking alone on the beach, and followed her at a distance. He waited until there were no others nearby. Then he rushed her, grabbing her from behind, dragging her into the dunes. She fought, clawed at his face, tried to scream. He pressed his hands around her throat until she went still. When Reeves asked what he did afterward, Duval answered in a flat, even tone, "I carried her toward the water. Let the tide take her. I didn't look back." He said he kept her tank top as a souvenir, carrying it for several days before throwing it from a pier into the ocean. The same shirt that would wash ashore weeks later and ultimately betray him nearly 20 years after the crime. He also admitted to the 2004 attack on Lisa Chen, describing it as an impulse. He remembered her scratching his face. He laughed faintly when he mentioned it, saying, "That one almost got me caught." Reeves said the laugh was quiet, almost casual, like someone recalling a story from work, not an attempted murder. Then came the confessions no one had expected. Without prompting, Duval began to speak about other women, names and places scattered along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. He described killing Rachel Martinez in Charleston, 2006, and Angela Foster in Mobile, 2008. He mentioned details that had never been released publicly, the type of jewelry one had been wearing, the exact location of a missing purse, the description of a vehicle abandoned near the harbor, details later verified by local authorities. By the end of the session, the full scope of his crimes was clear. Marcus Duval, formerly Marcus Wilkes, had been a serial killer hiding behind the ordinary face of a construction worker, a drifter, a hurricane survivor. He had moved from town to town, state to state, his crimes dissolving into the background noise of transient coastal life. He left no witnesses, no evidence, until a piece of fabric, preserved by salt and time, finally spoke for the women he silenced. When Reeves stood to leave, Duval looked up for the first time. "You took your time finding me," he said. Reeves paused, then replied quietly, "No, you took your time getting caught." The interrogation ended at 8:12 p.m. Reeves walked out into the humid Louisiana night, the weight of 19 years suddenly replaced by a heavier truth. The case wasn't just solved. It had uncovered a pattern of evil that had lived unnoticed in plain sight for 2 decades. On November 17, 2022, nearly 2 decades after Emma Walsh vanished into the Atlantic night, Marcus Duval was extradited to North Carolina under heavy security escort. Shackled, silent, and expressionless, he was transported from East Baton Rouge Parish Prison to the Dare County Detention Center, the same jurisdiction where Emma's parents had filed their first missing person report 19 years earlier. For the detectives who met the transport van that morning, it felt like history folding in on itself. The case that had begun with a single walk on the beach was finally coming home. Duval was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and concealment of death. He said little during his initial arraignment, answering only "yes, ma'am" and "no, sir." His face, reporters noted, remained impassive, neither anger nor guilt, only the dull vacancy of someone accustomed to confinement. But for David and Patricia Walsh, seated just a few rows behind the defense table, that first glimpse of the man who had taken their daughter was shattering. They had imagined his face for 19 years. Now, the imagination had become flesh. They attended every hearing. David, now 68, moved more slowly than before, but carried himself with quiet strength. Patricia, 66, sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap, a silver locket containing Emma's photo resting just below her collarbone. They listened to the evidence, to the legal language that tried to define what had been stolen from them. And through it all, they never once looked away from Duval. They wanted him to know her name. They wanted him to remember it every time he heard his own. On February 8, 2023, the case reached its final turning point. After weeks of negotiation, Duval pled guilty to all charges in exchange for the death penalty being removed as an option. The courtroom was still when the plea was entered. Reeves sat in the back row, the same folder of notes he'd carried since 2018 resting on his lap. Patricia held David's hand. The judge's words were simple, almost anticlimactic. The defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The echo of that sentence filled the room like a closing door. For the Walshes, it wasn't triumph. It was finality. The man who had taken everything from them would spend the rest of his days behind bars, but it could never equal what was lost. In the months that followed, Duval faced additional charges in South Carolina and Alabama for the murders of Rachel Martinez and Angela Foster. In both states, he pled guilty, accepting consecutive life sentences. He would never see the outside world again. Today, he is 52 years old, serving his time at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, a maximum security facility built of concrete and silence. His file is marked with 3 words that will follow him until his last breath: no possibility parole. On June 19, 2023, 20 years to the day after Emma disappeared, David and Patricia Walsh returned to Nags Head. The weather that morning mirrored the day she vanished, a clear sky, a calm sea, and wind moving gently across the dunes. They gathered near milepost 16, the same stretch of sand where their daughter had last been seen alive. Nearly 100 people came, family, friends, former classmates, even strangers who had followed her case for years. Detective Reeves stood quietly in the back, hands folded, hat in hand. The memorial service was simple, but deeply felt. Patricia spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. She talked about persistence, about what it meant to never stop believing that the truth would surface. She thanked law enforcement, forensic scientists, and every volunteer who had helped search the beaches 2 decades earlier. There were times, she said, when hope was all we had left. And sometimes that was enough. Then David stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a sheet of paper. It was a letter, one he had written to Emma the night before. His voice cracked once, then steadied. "Dear Emma, we found him. It took 19 years, but we found him. You never got to finish your degree, never got to become the marine biologist you dreamed of being, never got to have the life you deserved. But you didn't disappear, sweetheart. We made sure of that. We made sure everyone knew your name, knew your story, knew that you mattered. Today, there's justice. It's not the justice we wanted. We wanted you back. But it's the justice the law can give. We love you. We've loved you every single day, and we'll carry you with us for the rest of our lives. Love, Mom and Dad." When he finished, the beach was silent except for the soft rhythm of the tide. Patricia reached into a small basket beside her and released a cluster of 21 turquoise balloons, one for each year Emma had lived. The crowd watched as they lifted into the clear blue sky, rising higher and higher, until they drifted out over the ocean and disappeared into the horizon. That evening, as the sun dipped below the line of the sea, David and Patricia walked hand in hand along the water's edge. For the first time in years, there was a kind of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of knowing the truth. Emma Catherine Walsh is remembered today not as a victim, but as a brilliant young woman whose passion for the ocean defined her, whose kindness left a mark on everyone she met, and whose case ultimately helped expose a predator who had hidden for far too long. Her name now lives on through the Emma Walsh Forensic Science Scholarship Fund, created by her parents to support students pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice so that others might do what Detective Reeves had done, give voice to the silent, and bring justice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Sometimes justice takes decades. Sometimes it requires science, persistence, and heartbreak in equal measure. But when it finally arrives, when truth is no longer buried beneath time, it speaks not just for one lost life, but for all the lives that deserve to be remembered. When a person vanishes, time changes shape. Hours stretch into weeks, weeks into years, and memories harden into questions that never find answers. For 19 years, the name Emma Walsh lived in that space between hope and heartbreak. A missing woman, a cold case, a mystery whispered along the outer banks whenever the ocean grew quiet. Her photograph weathered under shop windows, her story passed between new detectives, each one vowing not to forget her. And through it all, her parents kept the light on in her bedroom, as though she might one day walk back through the door. In the end, it wasn't a witness or a confession that brought her home. It was science, a fragment of fabric, a trace of touch invisible to the human eye. DNA, tiny, unbreakable proof that the past never truly disappears. When that code was finally matched, when the system spoke her name, it was as if Emma herself had risen from silence to tell her story. Detective James Reeves would later say that no moment in his career felt heavier or more sacred than calling David and Patricia to deliver the news. He remembered Patricia's breath catching on the other end of the line, David whispering her name once, as if to make sure he'd heard it right. Relief and grief arrived together, inseparable. Justice, after all, doesn't erase pain, it simply gives it a place to rest. The Outer Banks still looks the same today. The dunes shift, the tides erase footprints, and every summer new travelers arrive seeking what they think is freedom. They walk the same beaches, watch the same sunsets, unaware that somewhere between the wind and the waves, a story once ended here, and another began. Because in every solved case, there is more than closure. There is warning. There is memory. There is the quiet understanding that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, persistence can find a way to bring truth to light. At the small memorial bench near milepost 16, there's a plaque that reads, Emma Catherine Walsh, 1981 to 2003. Loved the ocean, loved life. Visitors often stop to read it, not always knowing her story, but feeling something nonetheless. A soft gravity that makes them linger for a moment before moving on. And perhaps that is how remembrance truly works, not through fame or headlines, but through the simple act of being remembered by strangers. Emma's parents still visit every year. They bring flowers, sit quietly, and watch the tide come in. Sometimes, Patricia says, she imagines Emma's voice in the sound of the surf, a whisper, a laugh, a trace of who she was before the world changed. The case of Emma Catherine Walsh began with a disappearance. It ended with a voice returned. And in that return lies the quiet truth that every life, no matter how briefly lived, leaves a ripple in the world, one that can travel farther and last longer than anyone could ever imagine.